Okay, so today or tonight we're going to talk about 15 minutes about one of my absolute favorite subjects, which is router and switch exploits. I love this topic, so hopefully this talk does not suck like router and switches do. We're going to focus mainly on like SoHo, what they call SoHo, small office, home office equipment, but we are going to delve our toes into some bigger sort of hardware that you might see in the enterprise. So before I begin with this, why do we care? Like, why do we care about our networking equipment getting owned? When I was recently researching some Cisco exploits, and I kept coming across the same information in every write-up that I saw, and that was that no one uses the latest version of Cisco hardware in production because it's not trustworthy. No one uses the most recent version of Cisco firmware in production because they don't know if it's stable or not. Well, that actually opens you up to some nasty problems. We'll go over impact like towards the end of this presentation, but first, I want to talk a little bit about ExploitDB. So ExploitDB is a site that collects exploits, and they host like a public repository. It also comes on Kali. So it's a public resource for exploits. There's about 50,000 exploits listed in this site, and almost 1,600 of them are hardware. So that's primarily where I'm going to be drawing my information from, my exploits from that we're going to look at. And like I say here, we're going to mainly look at the web administrative interface with a little bit of focus on like VPN tunnels too. So those are the two main topics because those are the two main vulnerable areas. That represents like the greatest attack surface in my opinion for a lot of this networking gear. So like what kind of stuff do you see in a web interface on a networking switch? Well, you see the same sort of stuff you'd see on a regular like web app penetration test. You know, your cross-site scripting, your broken authentication, your information leaks, things that are like a dime a dozen that you'll find on almost any assessment, right? But they also offer an entire class of vulnerabilities that you will never see or very rarely will see in a web app assessment. And that is things like command injection and buffer overflows. I did web app pen testing for a couple of years, and I never saw one of these outside of the networking gear I was looking at on the side. So maybe that speaks to my breadth of experience, or maybe that speaks to the lack of these kind of problems in major web apps. So if you're not familiar, command injection is when like you call system with user input that you don't sanitize. That allows the attacker to submit malicious input that will get executed as system and do whatever the attacker wants, whatever the command is that they send. And why does this always lead to system compromise on networking equipment? Because everything runs as root. I've only seen a single device in all of my exploit hunting that had non-privileged accounts that like the web interface ran as. So really, if you can get a foothold, like a command execution foothold in a piece of networking equipment, like you don't have much fight after that. You just, you turn on telnet or you start a reverse shell, drop an interpreter payload, whatever you want, and you own the device, really. Which kind of leads me into buffer overflows. These are a little more esoteric, but you do see them all the time. Usually they're esoteric because the networking equipment runs PowerPC processors or ARM processors if you're lucky, MIPS processors. So your shell code looks a little bit different than it does in your standard x86 environment. Another thing that I see a lot is binary hardening protections are almost never enabled. So that means ASLIDEP, those things, which would make building exploits very difficult, are almost never present. So you don't have to worry about trying to bypass those because they're just not there. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from this talk, it's this slide. It's that if you are looking to build a solid base of knowledge in networking or hardware exploitation, go out to exploitdb and just read the hardware section. See what other people have come up with. See how other people develop exploits for different problems. If you have the hardware, run their exploits against it and try to get an understanding of how they work. This is the best way to build a base of knowledge for finding your own problems. I try to go out to exploitdb like once a week and just look at the new hardware exploits for like 20 minutes. And I can tell you that, yes, that's helped me find problems, like definitely. Okay, so we're going to look at some examples now. I'm going to post these slides somewhere when we're done with the presentation. So you'll be able to go through and look at these a little more in depth. But I want to highlight a couple of different resources. And that is the Synrio, which is used to be named Exhibitor. They do a lot of this this kind of work with like small office, home office exploitation. They're great. I mean, their stuff is top notch. It's a really great. They run a blog that goes into a lot of depth on how their exploits work. And probably their biggest success was the Devil's Ivy exploit, which was some library that was on like 19 million different devices. So that's definitely worth going out and looking at. The other one I want to highlight real quick is the router exploit. It's like Metasploit, but for routers. Why they needed a separate project for that is debatable, but it is the thing, and it has a lot of good modules in it that are pretty cool. So I want to look at maybe one of these. How much time do we have? Yeah, I want to look at maybe one or two of these and just like get an idea of what kinds of things people are finding out in publishing. So this is not very legible. Let's see if I can. Oh, I do. I figured it out. Okay, so you can kind of see this. So this is just a standard Python, right? No, it's C. Sorry, it's a C proof of concept where they're sending some UPnP data to a web service and executing a command by sending 800 A's and then their command. So they figured out some way to exploit a buffer without bounds checking to put a command on the stack and get it executed. And this is pretty cool. Like, if you've never done like UPnP testing, which like is not something that a lot of people do, this is a pretty cool little example of that. Like the first time I did UPnP testing, I had to get proxy chains set up to proxy my Miranda data to burp, and it was worth it because it taught me a lot of those tools, and it allowed me to find stuff like this. This stuff is not easy to find a lot of times, especially when you're dealing with command line interfaces that are not the standard web interfaces. Like a lot of the exploits that I have seen or developed, you can exploit them through the web interface. You just go to the networking gear web panel and like insert some bad stuff into the text field, and there you go. That's your shell. Something like this would be harder to find because, like I said, you'd have to use like Miranda, proxy chains, burp suite to like manipulate the traffic as it went over the wire. So this is a nice exploit. It demonstrates well the kind of nature of things that you will find out in the wild. Well, that's not what I wanted. Let's go back. So I won't go through them anymore because, like, I guess looking at code isn't the most exciting thing in the world. I thought it would be more exciting, but I'll show you a couple of other examples, and if you're interested, you can look at this. So there's another framework on top of routersploit or metasploit that does like wonders for web app testing, and that's the Beef framework. So if you've never heard of Beef, it's like the JavaScript exploitation framework. You hook a browser by loading their script in it, and then you can run all kinds of crazy shit to on the compromised browser to like collect photos of people and stuff like that. But one of the things that Beef does really well is cross-site request forgery exploitation. Now, when you hear cross-site request forgery or you see it on a web app pen test, it's not like the sexiest thing in the world, right? But this framework allows you to execute attacks that, when coupled with the nature of networking equipment, can be devastating. So, like, for example, one of these is a port mirroring attack, where the victim loads this malicious script, and all of a sudden, you've turned on port mirroring on the first port of the device, and you're just blasting the network with all the traffic that's going through the port. That could cause some serious problems on an enterprise network, right? Yeah, like, you don't want someone to just be able to turn on port mirroring on some random port. That's a bad thing. What else do I have up there? Being able to reset the password on a device. So, like, almost all of these devices have a set of credentials that you can easily find. Like, if you Google, in this case, D-Link DGS 1100 default credentials, you'll be able to find that information really easily. So being able to reset if the system admin has set up a password to protect their switch, you don't want to be able to reset that. This is one of the things that, again, Beef does really well. It lets you execute that payload so that you can reset that device and then get in real easily. You just log in with the default credentials. So this kind of demonstrates how cross-site request forgery in a real attack scenario can be valuable. So if you've never checked out Beef Framework, I highly recommend it. I happen to have written all 3 of these modules, so that's kind of why they're up there too. So this is probably the part of the talk where people really want to hear. All these exploits are cool. They can have varying levels of severity if they're actually used. But why should I care? Why do I care if my core router gets owned? The core router doesn't do anything but route traffic, right? Or send switch packets over the wire. In recent history, when we're talking about small office, home office equipment, the biggest thing that people were using this for was botnets, like the Mirai botnet, right? It was a bunch of compromised routers that then executed the command that the CNC server sent to it, or it retrieved from the CNC server. So that was the biggest threat for many years, but we're starting to see different things out there happening. And I think one of the things that we're going to see emerging in the next few years is, people really taking advantage of the data that goes over these devices. So if you're obviously on the core router or the main router in a house, you have all the traffic that's going through the network. You're in a perfect man-in-the-middle position. Now, that's not exactly the easiest way to compromise someone from outside their LAN, but it is one way. You could set up a man-in-the-middle proxy and just go to town on whatever data is coming over the wire. Now, probably the most dangerous scenario that happens on small office, home office equipment is this one. An attacker somehow seizes control of your home router. He then proceeds to change the upstream DNS server to one that he controls. And then you go and try to log on to your bank, and all of a sudden you're accessing your bank as controlled by the attacker, and when you log in, he steals your credentials and steals all your money. So this happens, it's even happening today. You hear about this sort of DNS cache poisoning attacks, and back on ExploitDB, the ability to change an upstream DNS server is considered an attack of its own. Even if you can't do anything else, if you can unauthenticated change the DNS server of a device, that's considered an entire attack class. And it's very severe for situations exactly like this, that allows them to control, what you load in your browser when you try to, go to a website. So kind of moving from small office to home office to more the enterprise, there's other scenarios, too, that can be really bad. So, if I have administrative privilege level 15 access to your core router, like I can turn that into a packet filter. And in fact, I know a guy in this room who has done that. So it's definitely possible. He's not paying attention right now, but yeah, he's done it. So, it's something that is definitely within the realm of possibility. What happens if I can turn your router into a packet filter? I can just like completely do all kinds of malicious stuff, but the biggest one probably is like sending data off the network that doesn't go into the mirror port for your SIM or packet management system to look at. There's other applications of that, but like this is probably, in my opinion, the most serious. And yeah, at the end, Brian Krebs alerts you to your data breach. So if I can offer any advice, it's to apply the patches. When when Cisco comes out with a new patch and it says this fixes security vulnerability X, Y, and Z, just apply it. Like maybe test it out in your lab and see if it works fine. And if it does, just send it out to the rest of your network. Because attackers do build exploits out of that information. Attackers and researchers will also go through the Cisco listings and develop exploits off of what little information is given there. So patch in the enterprise. In the small office, home office world, I would say the same thing. Like these companies make all the firmware available. They don't do such a good job of automatically patching the networking equipment. But man, just set a calendar event that says, okay, every 21st of the month on that Friday, I'm going to go look and see if there's a new firmware update for my router. And if there is, I'm going to update it. Like, that can save you a lot of heartache, in my opinion. The other thing I would look for is remote monitoring or remote access. A lot of routers have the option to turn that on and off. And if it's on, your web interface is accessible to the public internet on the WAN. And that's a bad deal. So those are the two suggestions I would have there. And that's kind of it. This was just a tool talk. It didn't go into incredible depth, but if you have any questions, I'd love to try to field those at this point. The question was, do I run across much x86 on the hardware side? And I would say not on proprietary systems. On open source stuff like pfSense boxes, yeah, I see it all the time. But on the proprietary stuff that's put out by large manufacturers, that stuff I almost never see x86 on. Good question. Anyone else? All right, thank you. Oh, yep. Sure. So the question was, like, in regards specifically to pfSense, what's the threat model? What kind of exploits do you see? Are they more prevalent than what you see on proprietary SoHo systems? The problem with pfSense exploits is they tend to be rare, but they tend to be extremely severe because they offer that command line interface that you can execute commands on through the web browser. So, like, if you have a pfSense cross-site request forgery exploit that you know will work, you can usually turn that into a complete system compromise. And in fact, there are a bunch of beef modules that do that, will allow you to mount that attack against a pfSense system via cross-site request forgery. Does that answer your question? Anybody else? All right, thanks for listening. We got Sean Flattery and Joseph Peppers up next, so stay tuned, and we will get them on stage.